In the decades between World War II and Nixon taking office, the relationship between the United States and China was chaotic. So there was just no contact. Nixon is vilified by history, and deservedly. Watergate was a terrible thing, and he did disgrace his office. But by going to China, that was a great act of statesmanship, and it showed America at its best, as not a country that retreats and hides, but reaches out to the rest of the world on an equal basis. Nixon was a lonely, insecure child. He didn't have any friends. Nixon compensated by, curiously, running for office. The shrewdest insight he had was to run as the candidate of the losers, because in high school there are more losers than there are winners. He wanted to be in politics, he knew he was good at it, and after World War II, it was a job. He came home and ran for Congress as a young, returning veteran, bringing youth and dynamism. He looked good in his uniform, and he was nominated and elected in a district in California that had been Democratic, and went to Congress in 1946. Nixon was a fairly traditional conservative Republican with one important exception. He was an internationalist. Nixon knew that we had to be in the world. Eisenhower, when he was nominated in 1952, didn't know Nixon from a hole in the wall, but saw that he could be useful on his ticket. Nixon was vigorous. He'd been a senator from California, and Nixon was a staunch anti-communist, both internally, finding Reds at home, and standing up to the Reds abroad. Nixon was a very good vice president. He was well informed. He represented Ike well all over the world. Nixon always made it his business not only to know what was going on in foreign countries, but to go there himself, to meet with foreign leaders. He did this all through his career, and he was good at it. I mean, he was not considered to be the most easygoing, popular guy, but foreign leaders liked Nixon for two reasons. Nixon did his homework, and Nixon did not condescend to them. He talked to them in an even way about their interests. He didn't speechify at them. He didn't preach at them. He talked interest with them. In 1959, President Eisenhower sent Nixon to Moscow to a trade fair. It wasn't going to be that big a deal, but Nixon was lucky enough or smart enough to confront Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, in debate. In a model kitchen, they stood there arguing over the dishwasher. Americans were looking for leaders who could stand up to communists. And in the debate, Nixon stood up to Khrushchev. That was very important, to show an American leader who could stand up to this blustering bully.
All that I can say, from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself.
Nixon was regarded as a fairly safe continuation of the Eisenhower administration, but there were a couple of problems. One is that Eisenhower is pictured as being kind of old and tired, so the idea was that the Eisenhower administration itself was tired. The other problem was Nixon was considered in some quarters as being a bit of a sleazebag. Richard Nixon ran tough campaigns as a congressman, and particularly running for the Senate. And he got the nickname Tricky Dick. JFK looked cool and calm in hand and ready to go.
Senator Kennedy will be the next president of the United States.
Nixon was a good sport about losing the 1960 election, and so he accepted his defeat, but it did kind of nag at him. Nixon tried to run for governor of California in 1962, and he lost in a close election, and he was very bitter about it. He gave a famous press conference in which he said, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore," to the press. He was seen as a bitter loser and written off. People thought that he was finished. By 1968, the country was just in torment. There were race riots, there were riots on campus, and Nixon saw an opening to come in as kind of the grown-up.
Let all nations know that during this administration, our lines of communication will be open. We seek an open world.
Nixon was thrilled to be president. He finally had made it. He loved Air Force One. He loved marching bands. He stood up a little straighter and puffed up his chest at his inaugural. His own chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, says Nixon loves being being the president. But always underneath with Nixon, there was this insecurity that showed itself. When Nixon comes to office in 1969, China's still in a deep freeze. There's no relationship between China and the United States. Nixon understood that we increasingly lived in a multipolar world, and that in that world, the balance of power was important, and wanted to create a world in which we could balance off or pit China against Russia and Russia against China to achieve a kind of balance of power. It was really a brilliant, far-thinking, forward-thinking approach to foreign policy. He begins secret diplomacy. He begins sending messages to the Chinese through Pakistan that we would be willing to meet with them. And then in the summer of 1970, he sent his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, on a secret mission to Beijing to set up talks.
I have requested this television time tonight to announce a major development in our efforts to build a lasting peace in the world.
Going to China was an incredibly elaborate exercise, partly because we hadn't been there at all. There was always the risk that things could go wrong. But Nixon was a seasoned hand at international diplomacy, and he understood the power of it, that American leaders have to go to foreign countries to make their presence felt and to represent their country. The Nixon administration advanced the heck out of the trip to China. They invited every major newsman, every network, so there was tremendous advanced publicity. People were watching him, and when he came off the plane and he shook hands with Zhou Enlai, it was a great moment.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China.
Nixon was showing by that handshake that we had entered a new age of getting along with our enemies. It was very powerful TV. Nixon wanted to put on a show, and the Chinese wanted to put on a show, so they did. Nixon went on the Great Wall. There were a lot of endless toasts that Nixon had to be careful about if he was going to get drunk. There were endless parades, handshakes. Nixon had to sit through endless boring Chinese operas, which he didn't like very much. But Nixon had put up with a lot, and he put up with that too. And it was a chance for the Chinese to see a Westerner and realize that the Westerner was not a warmonger, was not some crazy capitalist imperialist, but was a human being.
As we look at this wall, we do not want walls of any kind between peoples. And I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this, or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world.
There's always a risk in personal diplomacy. When he first got there, they were not absolutely sure that Mao would see him, but that didn't happen. Nixon did go to see him right away. And so it was just basically a good show. What Nixon accomplished in China was not any great treaty. We opened a diplomatic relationship that led to great economic ties between the two countries and brought China into the world. China was going to open up eventually. Somebody was going to go to China, but Nixon was the one who did. Nixon was the right man to lead the United States in that time in the Cold War. He was brilliant in diplomacy with both Russia and China, but his personal insecurities undermined him and eventually destroyed him. Most Americans have written off Nixon as a terrible president, and in some ways he was. He was the only president to be driven from office. But he was certainly a great president when it came to opening up China. And most people will have a vague memory of that, but they need to have a stronger memory of how important it was for an American president to reach out to an enemy like that and open the door.